The United States was a new country in the early 19th century. The American people embraced the guarantee of broad citizenship rights outlined in the U.S. Constitution. Yet some Americans began to question the true validity of these absolute freedoms. They realized that all members of the American society did not share equal citizenship rights, especially those individuals suffering under the cruel institution of slavery.
The Second Great Awakening in the United States, which motivated people to reconsider what being a good American was all about and to become re-empowered. For them, the greatest generation, the framers and the founders, those guys were dying off. And in the early part of the 1800s, Americans began saying, oh, who are we now? What are we now? What do we need to accomplish now? And they turned to these great goals, that what they believed, and began to then reinterpret. Enslavement was being considered, and proper treatment and humanitarian treatment of human beings, full common man citizenship rights, and maybe temperance would contain and control and help reify and make more rich the American democratic experience. So a lot of these ideas, with a sort of a new dedication to a new emerging Native American Christianity, these ideas were all emerging together in the early 1800s, and people were feeling empowered in the same way that the prior generation had felt empowered about the Enlightenment ideals that they were taking on in the late 1700s.
I think we need to look back at the role that Angelina and Sarah Grimke played back in the 1830s, because they were the first ones who began publicly speaking against slavery. A couple sisters from South Carolina that had moved north. So if you put this in perspective and you think this was in the 1830s, this was at least 15 years prior to Seneca Falls. So before women could speak and talk about getting the right to vote, they had to be given the right to speak, and they did not have that at that point. It was unacceptable behavior for a woman. The Grimke sisters were very instrumental in doing that.
Despite repeated efforts to silence her, Angelina Grimke was the first woman to speak before a United States legislative body when she shared the cause of abolition with the Massachusetts State Legislature in 1838.
A recognition of their political equality, also of their individuality, because the original reason they couldn't vote was it was implied that they had no interest of their own, that according to covert, part of the British common law that we inherited and chose to adapt in state constitutions, the woman's identity disappeared upon marriage into that of her husband. So the idea was women's interests were synonymous with those of their family, and the husband, as the head of the household, represented that family unit in politics. The woman's vote would have been redundant in their view.
Women were supposed to be confined to the home, there as demure wives and mothers, taking care of the private sphere of life, the children, the children's moral education, and education for survival.
The early part of the women's movement started with opposition to slavery. Lucretia Mott, who in 1830, around 1837, formed the first female anti-slavery society in Philadelphia. Okay, again, when we talk about Seneca Falls as 1848, that's 11 years before that. She was already involved in that process.
In 1840, activist Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton traveled to London to attend the World Anti-Slavery Convention. There, these women found that because of their gender, they were not allowed to speak or vote on the convention floor. Mott and Stanton left London with a new resolve.
When they came back, they had decided that they would meet and discuss what they could do back in the United States.
So they are linking hands with African American men and women over the anti-slavery movement. And then the realization that as they are working for the rights of the enslaved, they begin to realize that, we don't have these rights. So began to push for the rights of women as well.
Lucretia Mott was a Quaker, and it's important in this context to understand that Quakers played a significant role early on because Quakers allowed women to speak. Quakers allowed the women in Quaker meetings to be able to speak. That was something unheard of in any other religion or any other faith. That gave her an opportunity to be involved on a more equal basis with a man. She had the oratorical skills that were necessary, as well as the organizational skills to implement what Katie Stanton wanted to do. She demonstrated in so many ways that she was a very calm and controlled person. She was not someone who would be ruffled. So if she was engaged in any kind of discussions, particularly religious discussions, she was very knowledgeable about the Bible, and she could discuss that very openly and very logically. Of all of the individuals that we learn about, she probably was more the foundation, the rock on which that suffrage movement turned.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her husband were members of the Anti-Slavery Society where they lived. Her father had been a lawyer, and she would listen in to what he was telling his clients and became rather disturbed that when she discovered that women didn't have the same rights that men had. She discovered this as a child. And so she was a very keen student of the law. Even though she wasn't a lawyer, she was well read and wrote a tremendous amount as well. She was married, she had several children, but she firmly believed that women deserved complete equality and they needed the right to vote.
Mott and Stanton soon organized the first Women's Rights Convention. It was held on July 19th and 28th, 1848, in Seneca Falls, New York.
The story begins before the Civil War with a meeting of anti-slavery women at a Methodist church in Seneca Falls, New York. They met because they had been excluded from an anti-slavery meeting in London, and they were miffed about that, and they wanted to talk about what rights women should have. And so at this meeting at Seneca Falls, they started discussing the things that women needed and ways that women were not treated with respect or as equals. And they began talking about rights within the church, rights of a variety of kinds, being legally dead under the law because women who were married had no rights to their own property in almost every state.
At the convention, Stanton lobbied that the women's right to vote held the key to achieving their social agenda. She believed this measure should be added to the platform of rights that the convention was working toward endorsing. Privately, Mott disagreed with Stanton. Mott felt Stanton was taking things too far. Her concern was that the insistence of women's voting rights would be detrimental to the convention.
And by far the most controversial right that was brought up at that meeting and later became one of their resolutions was that women needed the right to vote. In other words, if women could vote, things would be different in this country.
The one person who stood up and seconded the motion on the resolution for giving women the right to vote was Frederick Douglass.
And this is something that he thought was important, along with the abolition of slavery, that he also thought granting women the right to participate in the government was essential.
Men who were forward thinkers supported women's emergence into the democratic sphere and into public work. And women in turn who were forward thinkers understood how wrong enslavement was.
At the end of this meeting, the delegates signed their names to a declaration of sentiments. if you read this document today, it very much resembles the Declaration of Independence. That was their model. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal.
Those who attended the Seneca Falls Convention left there with a new vision and the inspiration to spread the message of human rights and equality throughout the United States. Lucy Stone soon became another strong voice of the movement. Stone battled inequality on all fronts as a strong orator and writer. She was also the first Massachusetts woman to earn a college degree, and when she was married, she rewrote the traditional marriage vows to express her views of gender equity, and also declined to take her husband's last name. Sojourner Truth was an African-American woman who had escaped slavery in 1826. Soon after, she devoted her life to civil rights causes and became renowned for her activism. Her extemporaneous speech at the 1851 Ohio Women's Conference became known as Ain't I a Woman? It addressed racism and sexism and inspired those who were there to a call for action. Another activist, Amelia Bloomer, started the first woman's newspaper owned, edited, and operated by a woman. She also helped to popularize a new woman's style of dress. This garment looked like a woman's traditional dress, but it had gatherings that could be tied at the ankles that resembled men's pants. The public soon gave this fashion trend the name bloomers.
And these were very, very controversial. Even though it really looked like a skirt, when women walked, they looked like pants. And women were not supposed to wear pants. That was criticized very heavily. And so Amelia Bloomer's fashion statement did not really take off until the 20th century.
Bloomer returned to Seneca Falls in 1851 and brought with her a young Quaker activist named Susan B. Anthony. She introduced Anthony to Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Stanton and Anthony forged a partnership that lasted over the next several decades.
Because Susan B. Anthony was not married, she had a certain level of freedom that Elizabeth Cady Stanton did not have, because Elizabeth Cady Stanton had several children that were under her care. But Susan B. Anthony was able to go out and speak.
She was the one that went out and made the speeches. She was the one who basically carried the torch. Cady Stanton had several children, so she could not leave her home. She became the writer, Susan B. Anthony became the orator, and the two of them blended together very nicely. But again, it was Susan B. Anthony that did a lot of the legwork.
She was significant because of her leadership abilities, and she partnered with Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the pre-Civil War time period to work for married women's property rights in New York.
Their partnership would soon manifest the cause of women's rights to the highest echelons of the United States government.
What's always amazed me about all of these women, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, is not to really isolate them as individuals, but to see them as a part of the reformist tradition of the 19th century, and to really consider the nature of reform. These women were not just women's rights activists, they were also anti-slavery women. These are women, as a part of this reformist tradition, who have decided that society can be perfected, that things can be better. It's just that you have to step back and create an environment in which people can be better. They are the mothers, if anything, of the movement at this point.
Throughout the 1850s, abolition, women's rights, and temperance continued to be the leading social causes of the day for women. Many committed themselves to the cause of equality and freedoms for all Americans. However, these issues soon fractured the fabric of the country, and the American Civil War began. With this conflict, the momentum of the women's rights movement dampened for the next several years.
The women who had supported suffrage for women and had supported abolition for African Americans understood the critical moment in time that the Civil War placed the nation. And there was not a pause in advocacy for these issues, but there was a redirected concern to the men on the front and the war that was taking thousands of lives. The women in the North and the women in the South were left alone to handle things on their own and run things on their own. Learning emerged from that, and we in the South carry the blessing and the stigma of the Southern belle and the sort of delicate Southern flower. The Civil War proved that false. Southern women and women across the United States were out doing the hard work of survival. Women were truly, genuinely struggling during the fighting of the war when the men were away. We're going to see women emerging into the public sphere in the years after the Civil War in greater and greater numbers over increasing numbers of decades.
A lot of them said, whether we wanted to or not, we were forced out into the world, and now that we're in the world, we recognize that we have a need to clean up politics, protect the unprivileged in the region, and also to change laws and customs such that women who need to represent themselves and to support themselves have a better opportunity to do so.
Right after the end of the Civil War, women transferred their organizational activity from different soldiers' aid societies that they had been involved in to relief groups and to memorialization groups. So they continued to organize, and all of these groups just very much enabled women to gain experience in leadership, fundraising, just a lot of different organizational skills they developed that then they used in the suffrage movement as well.
As the war comes to an end, and with the ratification of the 13th Amendment and the fulfillment of that, seemingly the fulfillment of that abolition objective, a resurgence of ideas about equal rights for everyone manifests itself on the national American scene.
After the Civil War, Congress did approve 3 amendments that are referred to as the Civil War or Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution gave African Americans freedom. Slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution, which is actually quite long, gave African American men equality under the law. They could not be treated as second-class citizens. And then far more controversial than that one was the 15th Amendment, which gave African American men only the right to vote.
The first critical point in which women are finding themselves slapped on the knuckles is the passage by Congress and then the speedy ratification of the 14th Amendment, which for the first time in United States history clarifies that citizenship in the United States is for males only. And the word male is inserted in the 14th Amendment and thus inserted in the Constitution for the first time in the history of the Constitution 3 times in the 14th Amendment.
So both Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony opposed the 14th Amendment because they did not like the way it defined male citizens as the voters or male voters. And they didn't want that added into the Constitution because they felt that that would then be a hindrance to getting women the right to vote. So, and it wasn't the greatest hour for some of the white female suffragists because they used sort of racist and elitist language to speak against the right of African American men to vote.
Some of them felt they deserved the right to vote instead of or before African American men. And this is where they part ways in some cases with people like Frederick Douglass, who are saying, but you as white women, you already have coverage for and protection for yourselves and your families, that the 15th Amendment is going to allow for African American men, that they can use their votes to improve their communities and protect their families. But you already have this. So it's more important that we, African American men, get it, because we kind of know that society is not going to change that radically and allow women to vote and African Americans to vote.
Now, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were quite upset about the 15th Amendment because they had worked with Frederick Douglass, a former slave and ardent spokesman for the abolition of slavery. They had worked with him to get slavery abolished, and so when it came to the right to vote, they too felt that women should be included in that 15th Amendment. But Frederick Douglass's response to them was, "The hour hath not yet come."
And in 1869, they divided into two groups. Because the word male was in there, it did not allow women to vote. And what Susan B. Anthony and Cady Stanton believed was that it should not just be the Negro's hour, it should be the woman's hour at the same time. Lucy Stone thought that it basically would be better to have at least the Negro man get the right to vote than to get basically no one with the right to vote. And that led to the split in the suffrage movement to National Suffrage Association and the American Suffrage Association.
Lucretia Mott continued her activism as well and worked to heal the split between the two groups. She died in 1876 at the age of 87. The year 1872 brought other activists back to the forefront as Sojourner Truth attempted to vote for president, but was turned away in her adopted home state of Michigan. Susan B. Anthony also registered and voted in Rochester, New York.
She actually went and voted, even though it was illegal for her to do so. That was rather scandalous.
And for that act, she was arrested. She was put in prison, and she would have been released if she had agreed to pay the fine, but she declined to do that. She wanted to proceed through the process.
Victoria Woodhull was another leader in the women's suffrage movement. After becoming a spiritual advisor to Cornelius Vanderbilt, he helped her to become the first woman to own a brokerage firm on Wall Street. This success helped Woodhull buy and edit a weekly newspaper. Through the paper, she spoke out for suffrage rights and labor reform. Soon, her popularity rose in political circles, and in 1872, the Equal Rights Party nominated her as the first woman candidate for the United States presidency. This decade also brought on the emergence of the largest women's organization in the United States, the Women's Christian Temperance Union.
This organization had really taken off after the Civil War under the leadership of Frances Willard.
The decision of Frances Willard to bring the Women's Christian Temperance Union into the women's suffrage battle was immensely important. Many women around the country had viewed the suffrage movement as a more somewhat radical outgrowth of the anti-slavery movement, and from New England in particular. And in order for it to succeed on a national level, it was going to have to grow way beyond that. It was going to have to be a truly nationwide movement that had supporters all over the country. When the Women's Christian Temperance Union got involved in the battle, it brought large numbers of women who were more conservative and who may have viewed suffrage as something that more radical women advocated. But they began to recognize that they were relatively powerless with politicians as compared to the, shall we say, persuasiveness of the liquor industry, and that they were going to need the vote. And so it actually began to seem to large numbers of quite conservative women that women's suffrage was going to be vital for them to achieve their goals. The Women's Christian Temperance Union helped convert a large number of moderate to conservative women into seeing voting as a Christian duty.
Because women felt that that was a family issue, that it affected families very much when people, especially men, drank too much. Women's work through that organization is seen very much as a precursor to women's suffrage work and just women's collectivism and trying to make reforms. That was one of the key ones. And then, of course, the progressive movement and just all the different ways in which women worked to try to improve the lives of children, the lives of people who lived in urban areas, food safety, a lot of different issues like that. Women became very involved in improving education, that kind of thing.
In Memphis, Tennessee, Elizabeth Avery Merriweather was an author and skilled speaker who aligned herself with the Women's Christian Temperance Union. As her popularity grew, she used her speaking skills to travel from state to state to appeal for justice for women.
I think from Tennessee's perspective, Tennessee's role in the ratification process goes back to a lecture that Elizabeth Merriweather gave in 1877. And that was the first indication that here was someone speaking about women's rights. But she delivered it up in Louisville, Kentucky. And the editor of the Louisville Courier, who was an anti-suffragist, was so impressed by her delivery that he said that anyone that really wanted to hear someone who could basically articulate a well-reasoned argument on this, they should listen to her. That's 1877.
As Elizabeth went national, her sister-in-law, Lyde Merriweather, stepped in, becoming the president of the Tennessee chapter of the WCTU, where she worked to form both black and interracial chapters on the local level. She was also one of the first to address wage inequity for women and started a women's shelter in Memphis. In 1878, Stanton and Anthony were finally able to get a suffrage amendment introduced on the floor of the U.S. Senate. The amendment spent the next 4 decades in Congress. It was widely known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Neither Anthony nor Stanton would live to see its passage.
The South really controlled Congress. The South really controlled the ability for constitutional amendments to be achieved. The South had a dominance in the United States Congress in terms of power.
Among Southern men on changing the way in which they see the role of women in society. This is still, in some cases, a very patriarchal system. And the role of women is not to participate as equals in terms of government responsibilities.
Historically, the suffrage movement for women was connected in the North with the abolitionist movement. So there were Southern whites who were very skeptical of the women's suffrage movement because they saw it as growing out of and growing along with that abolitionist movement in the 19th century, which it did.
A lot of white Southern conservatives saw the 15th Amendment, which had enfranchised African American men, as something that had been forced upon them, that because accepting the 14th and 15th Amendments had been required of states as part of the price of re-entry into the Union, many of them said that this had been done as if in a hostage situation, and so they really had never believed that the federal government had the right to interfere in voting requirements.
In 1890, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association came together. The National American Women's Association, or NAWSA, was born under the leadership of Elizabeth Cady Stanton.
The founding of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which we generally refer to as NAWSA, was quite a milestone because it now has women speaking together with a united voice for the franchise, for the right to vote.
What they'd come to reach an agreement is that the way to achieve ratification was through a federal amendment as opposed to a states' rights approach.
Soon, a young Midwesterner made her way onto the national scene with NAWSA. Carrie Chapman Catt was a great organizer and orator, and Susan B. Anthony immediately bonded with her. In 1895, Stanton published a book called The Women's Bible. It was critical of the Bible's passages on women's obedience to men. The conservative members of NAWSA found offense in her publication, and Stanton was removed by vote from leadership, with Anthony taking the helm. Carrie Chapman Catt assumed leadership of NAWSA for her first term in 1900. Shortly thereafter, both Anthony and Stanton passed away.
Really, in the 1890s, that's this sort of commencement, I think, we envision of this sort of second generation of women who were beginning to take over, the emergence of people such as Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw and Harriet Stanton Blatch, who will ultimately be the ones to take the women's suffrage movement into the 20th century.
Also during this time, the Tennessee chapter of the Women's Christian Temperance Union found a new leader to take them into the 20th century with Selina Holman.
They found a very fine leader, Selina Moore Holman, who was the wife of a doctor from Fayetteville, Tennessee. She became the state president of the WCTU, the temperance organization, and she mobilized those women. Soon there were temperance unions in every county in the state of Tennessee, and some counties and cities had multiple unions. They had a broad agenda. Certainly the banning of alcohol was chief among their reforms that they wanted to see happen, but they wanted better juvenile detention centers for children who were arrested for making crimes. They wanted to beautify cities. They wanted to improve city government. They had a whole menu of activities they were interested in, libraries, schools. And one of those things that ultimately became a small but controversial department of the Women's Christian Temperance Union was a department about women having the right to vote.
The temperance movement took off like hotcakes, and pretty much every little county and community had a temperance union, and that permitted women to learn community organizing, to learn interfacing with their legislators, to practice going to Nashville, to dealing with men at the political level, to organizing with the other women in their communities, and to feeling empowered to have a public voice. So the emergence of women into the public sphere and getting practiced participation in getting legislation passed was the role that the Women's Christian Temperance Union played in the state of Tennessee, and it was powerful. Women were successful, and they became learned in the ways of politics.
Another strong leader for women's rights was found in Knoxville with Lizzie Crozer French, who worked tirelessly for working women in the areas of education and social reform. In 1896, she founded the Women's Educational and Industrial Union. She was also a stalwart supporter of the passage of voting rights for women. Memphis native Mary Church Terrell was a notable leader of black women in the national suffrage movement. After graduating Graduating from Oberlin College, she moved to Washington, D.C. and became a prominent member of Washington society, while also advocating for blacks and women's causes. Terrell was a constant reminder to the members of NAWSA not to exclude black women in the suffrage cause. She became one of the founding members of the NAACP. Some American industries, sensing radical changes if women got the right to vote, put their support and money behind the anti-suffragist movement.
The opposition to women's suffrage was supported financially by many manufacturers, and some of the manufacturers were the cotton textile owners in New England and in the South, who employed large numbers of women and children. The liquor industry, of course, was extremely important. Carrie Chapman Catt once referred to the liquor industry as the invisible enemy that set back their cause at least 40 years. And another major source of opposition were the railroads. It was just the general sense that women were out to clean up corruption in politics, and they relied heavily on that in order to serve their interests.
On May 25, 1911, the industrial labor conditions for women and children made national headlines when a fire broke out at the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory in New York, New York. The factory was located on the upper floors of a 10-story building. Many of those who were employed there jumped to their deaths due to exits being locked to prevent unauthorized breaks. 123 women died, including 2 14-year-old girls.
The real serious political pressure in Washington that moved this amendment before Congress in the first place and was able to secure President Woodrow Wilson's endorsement came from the very young group, including Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, and both of whom had worked with the suffrage movement and had been trained, if you will, in the early part of the 1900s in Great Britain. They brought some of those skill sets back to the United States. And initially they worked under the umbrella and within the framework of NAWSA, and they were part of what was the Congressional Committee to sort of do outward manifestations and liaison, but they became much more radicalized and took on all of these sort of public presentations, such as the famous 1913 Women's Suffrage March on Washington.
In 1913, veterans of the suffragette movement in Britain took leadership of the Congressional Union arm of NAWSA and soon initiated radical activities. Alice Paul and Lucy Burns planned a parade of 5,000 suffragists, all clad in white, to march through the streets of Washington, D.C., hoping to stop in front of the White House on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. However, due to the lack of police protection and the crowd surge of 500,000 people who had come to watch, the march ended in a riot, with several women injured. Also participating in the march was one of the founders of the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago, activist Ida B. Wells. Wells was a former slave who became a teacher and notable journalist. Originally from Memphis, she had escaped to Chicago after her writings on systematic lynchings had led to death threats. Before the march, Wells was told by Alice Paul that all blacks should march in the back as to not offend the Southern members of NAWSA. As the parade progressed, she slipped through the crowd to march defiantly alongside some of the white leaders. She too became one of the founding members of the NAACP. In 1915, Carrie Chapman Catt took back leadership of NAWSA for a second time. She quickly steadied the inorganization in the ranks, and with her recruiting efforts, the number of volunteers swelled to 1 million. In 1916, Alice Paul left NAWSA, forming the National Women's Party. Her belief was that civil disobedience was the only effective way to further their cause. As America entered World War I, Catt involved NAWSA in support for the war, garnering the vote of public opinion with her efforts. Paul and her group formed what were called the Silent Sentinels and picketed the White House daily. She, along with some of her other members, were arrested and jailed in deplorable conditions, leading Paul to stage a hunger strike and to be housed in the psychiatric unit of the prison. There she was force-fed by a tube leading to her stomach.
And it was their willingness to go to prison and to be force-fed in prison that drew horrible press attention to women's plight, and they took on those actions.
The number of women that went through those prisons made a trip around the country. So people had a chance to hear their stories, hear how they were stripped down, how they were treated and mistreated and abused. And that brought, again, an awareness to the nation that something was not right, that these women should be allowed to protest even though they might disagree with them, that they should not be subjected to that type of treatment.
The notoriety of these arrests was an embarrassment to the Wilson administration, and in 1918, Woodrow Wilson announced his support of the suffrage cause. In 1919, America's first Congresswoman, Jeanette Rankin, was voted into office by the free voting state of Montana. She quickly reintroduced the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, and it was finally passed by both houses of Congress. From there, it was on to the states for ratification by a 2/3 majority of 36 states.
It then became a matter of ratifying the amendment, which meant that they had to have at least 36 states to ratify it to make it official. The first few states ratified relatively soon after President Wilson signed it, and then it moved on throughout the rest of the country.
The entire Deep South had rejected the amendment, and a few states like Florida wouldn't even hold a session for it. And on Tuesday, August 17th, North Carolina had rejected the amendment, and Delaware had rejected it back in June of 1920. Tennessee was really the only state they had left.
We have a strong history of moderate progressivism that's forward-thinking, and we have been a leader of the South and distinct from the Deep South's resistance to forward progress.
The legislature had been called into special session by Governor Roberts, who was a very nervous politician, fearful that he might lose his re-election for governor in the November election. He called the House and Senate back to Nashville to make a decision about the ratification of the 19th Amendment.
So all they had to do was bring the special session together, and the expectation would be that they would easily ratify it. It would be a done deal. But what they didn't anticipate was that a number of the southern states and people that supported other southern states realized that if this goes through, what is going to happen is it's going to be shoved down our throat again, just like the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were. And that's what made the resistance start to develop strongly. People from all over the country that were opposed also came to Nashville.
The Tennessee suffragists were very pleased because it looked like they had a solid majority. And Kat, who had been through it all by now, said, well, you just watch, because between now and when the vote is taken, they'll fall off the list one by one. And they did.
The people opposing women's suffrage had really mobilized. This was their last stand. The women that opposed women's suffrage were led by Josephine Pearson. She was fiercely opposed to women having the right to vote, and it was said that she had sworn to her on her mother's deathbed that she would do everything she could to prevent that dreaded Susan B. Anthony Amendment from being ratified in the state of Tennessee.
She thought women had no place in politics, in government, and any sort of leadership roles like that. So she led the anti-suffrage forces in Tennessee. And then when Tennessee called their special session on August 9th, 1920, she headed up to Nashville and got all the anti-suffragists together. And of course, she's playing the race card saying, you don't want to give black women the vote, do you? So she got a lot of Confederate veterans there helping her persuade people that we don't need to ratify this amendment. So she was a force to be reckoned with, for sure.
All of the major players coalesced here. Carrie Chapman Catt came. She had a room in the Hermitage Hotel. Josephine Pearson, who was the leader of the anti-suffragists, she initially, I think, registered at the Tulane Hotel, but then she came and was moved to the Hermitage. So you imagine you've got these two opposing forces that are congregated in the same hotel.
The Senate ratified it fairly quickly by a significant margin. But in the House of Representatives of Tennessee, there was delay after delay. So after a variety of delays in the Tennessee House of Representatives, the vote is going to take place on August the 18th.
It was known as the War of the Roses at the time. There were only male legislators, of course, and if you wore a yellow rose in your lapel, you were supporting suffrage. If you had a red rose, you were opposed to it. There were people that actually, representatives that changed their position from after having committed that they would support suffrage, and the prominent one is Speaker Walker. Seth Walker had made a commitment that he would support suffrage and he would lead the fight for it. So he becomes the focal point in the opposition. When the 18th of August arrived, Speaker Walker felt he had the votes. And in order, though, to protect the legislators who were on the fence, who might be in a situation where if they voted one way or the other, they would be voted out of office, he would give them the opportunity, basically, to vote to table the motion. And the idea is if you table the motion, it'll be brought up in the next session. Seth Walker stepped down and let Representative Overton occupy the speaker's seat so that they could process the motions through. He called for the motion to accept the Senate having already approved it. He intervened before a second could be made on that motion, and he made the motion to table. Then they started through the roll call vote, but at some point, Banks Turner stood up when the count was 48-47, and he said, "I wish to be recorded as against the motion to table." Some people were saying, well, it's tabled. No, it can't be. And then others were saying, recount. So they decided then to have the second roll call vote. One story has it that Seth Walker, who was a friend of Banks Turner, was at Banks Turner's desk with his arm around his shoulder, entreating him to vote to table it. At some point, Turner stood up, threw off his arm, and said no. That created the second tie. At that moment, Seth Walker, probably infuriated by the fact that Turner had done that to him as a friend, decided that he would force the vote on the amendment.
Well, on the third roll call, Walker's like, well, we're going to have a vote on the merits right now. I can kill this resolution right here, right now, because we have to have a majority or it won't pass. Well, Harry T. Byrne had read the letter from his mother that morning, and that's when she used her immortal line, "Hurrah, vote for suffrage, don't keep them in doubt." And then she said, a few pages later, "Don't forget to be a good boy to help Mrs. Catt with her rat. She's the one that put ratification, ha." It's a folksy chit-chat, but she works in the suffrage message in there. So he takes her advice and he realizes this amendment is not going to pass without his help, so he changes his vote on the roll call on the merits to yes, and that is 49-47. He breaks the tie, and the amendment is ratified, and then it's pandemonium in the State House chamber. His vote put it over. Of course, he had a lot of help from suffragists working since 1848, but it came down to the one vote and a little nudge from Mother made it happen.
They ratified it. They sent it on to Secretary Colby up in Washington, D.C., and on August 26th, it became official.
It took George Washington 6 years to rectify men's grievances by war, but it took 72 years to establish women's rights by law. Woman's suffrage is a long story of hard work and heartache, crowned by victory.
In November of 1920, my grandmother, with my mother by the hand, went to vote for the first time because of something that happened right in Nashville, Tennessee.
In 2016, a statue honoring some of the women who played a role in the American suffrage movement both nationally and for the final vote in Nashville was unveiled in Nashville's Centennial Park. The women commemorated were Carrie Chapman Catt, the president of NOSA at the time of ratification, and Dallas Dudley, most noted for her lobbying efforts in the final ratification fight. J. Frankie Pierce, who fostered cooperation between black and white women's groups to support ratification. Sue Shelton White, one of Alice Paul's silent sentinels and an effective lobbyist for the final vote. And Abby Crawford Milton, a Chattanooga suffrage leader who came to Nashville to help secure passage of the amendment. Since 2016, on August 26th, or Women's Equality Day, there have been celebrations and commemorations as wreaths are laid upon the monument. In 2019, the day's event marked the start of the year-long Tennessee celebration of the centennial anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment.
This is the day, August 24th in 1920, that Governor Roberts signed the certificate to send the ratification report to Washington to the Secretary of State, Bainbridge Colby. Bainbridge Colby got the certificate 2 days later on the 26th of 1920 and signed it into law, making women's voting the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Today we are here to get things started and to acknowledge all the women that were working in 1919 and to take some inspiration from everything that they have done.
Today is really a dream come true. We have been working on getting to this day since 2010, and these 9 women that are on the Tennessee Woman Suffrage Monument Board, we raised nearly $1 million in private funds to engage local artists, renowned artist, Alan LaQuire, to provide the sculpture and this monument, representing the women from Tennessee who in 1920 fought so hard for women to be able to get the right to vote.
I personally think I've voted in every election that I've been old enough to vote in, and I treasure the right to do so.
So today means a lot to me as somebody who is very interested in women's equality and women's rights. And so having the event that happened 99 years ago happen in Nashville is very big. It's one of the reasons why I get involved in advocacy and in advocating for women's rights.
And today was such an important day just to celebrate the 99th anniversary of women obtaining the right to vote in Tennessee's historic place in that history. We are going to spend the next year here in Nashville celebrating this historic event, and I'm just so happy to be a part of it.
I'm going to do everything I can to support women and women's causes and the women's right to vote and the role that Tennessee played in this great achievement in the history of our nation.
This is an absolutely astounding day. Amazing that we would remember that there was a time when women did not have the right to vote. But to commemorate this time when women marched to this particular site to celebrate and to push that they have a right, an inalienable right of life, liberty, surely in the pursuit of happiness. That taxation without representation is tyranny. So we must support the idea of unity. And this is amazing that 99 years ago, that on this site, we indeed pushed for this to occur. Well, we're going to celebrate this. And we thank God that we live in a country of freedom, justice, and equality.
This day is very historic and important for our city because we are 1 year away from this magnificent centennial celebration of women getting the right to vote. This city was pivotal in that, and that we are excited and looking forward to everyone's participation in our 100th anniversary giving us the right to vote.
So thanks to Banks Turner, Joseph Hanover, and Harry Byrne, and all of the wonderful men in the Tennessee General Assembly who voted for women to win the right to vote. Nobody gave them anything. Women won the right to vote, and all American women vote today thanks to Tennessee.
When the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution, it was a major recognition of women as individuals who had a right to vote and represent their own interest in politics.
I think women can contribute so much to our democracy by having more of a role. And I don't think you have to vote on somebody because they're a man or a woman. I think you have to look at them as an individual who has an approach on addressing issues that the country faces throughout its history and decide, is that person somebody that I would support? And I agree with what their position is.
In many cases, the person that we elect to office, we just understand it's going to be a male. We understand that it will probably be a white male. But that doesn't really reflect American society. And that what you see happening now is women, and in particular younger women, black and white, who are stepping forward and saying, these are things that we can do. We have ideas, we understand that we have as much of a right to participate in the national government and in local governments and in state governments as any other American citizen.
If you look at any legislative body at any level in the United States, pretty much they're still, predominantly male, and so women make up more than half of the population in the United States, but they don't make up that percentage within, certainly not within Congress and not within most state legislatures or even city councils and down to that level.
Well, I think it's important to look at the fact that the amendment was passed in 1920, and that is almost 100 years ago. So it has taken almost 100 years to get to the point where we remark on the number of women seeking elected office. Not that there have not been women in office during this past century, but we're remarking on it like it's something notable, that we're getting closer to approaching the actual proportions representative of the population. And it has taken 100 years. It's like looking at the end of the Civil War up to the Voting Rights Act for African Americans that took 100 years.
For universal democratic suffrage is truly understanding what the core of the United States is all about. It is a struggle, it is an ongoing battle, it has not stopped yet, and the rights for individuals must continue to be maintained. So having this moment in history, it's like a carpe diem moment, an educational moment that we can grasp to elucidate the need for full citizenship in the United States and how that is not a static understanding, but it is one that requires ongoing exercise of active engagement and proactive participation by all Americans.